The wind hit first, a low moan across the high plains that stripped the last dead leaves from the cottonwoods. Cole felt it in his bones before he saw the sky darken, a familiar dread that tasted of iron and ice. He'd been tracking a wounded elk for 2 days, a foolish risk so late in the season, but his supplies were low and the winter ahead promised to be lean. Now the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a churning mass of gray that swallowed the sun. The first flakes of snow weren't flakes at all. They were hard, stinging pellets driven by a gale that seemed to rise from the frozen earth itself. He pulled his collar higher, the rough wool scratching his jaw. His horse, a steady-footed roan named Buck, shifted nervously beneath him, its breath pluming in the rapidly dropping temperature. "Easy, boy," Cole murmured, his own words snatched away by the wind. He abandoned the elk's trail. The hunter was now the hunted, and the predator was the storm. Survival was the only priority. He knew this country, had spent years reading its moods, its subtle shifts and warnings. This was no mere squall. This was a blizzard, a white death that could bury a man in a standing sleep. He needed shelter, and he needed it now. There was a line shack 10 miles east, but 10 miles in this was 100, an impossible distance. He recalled a small homestead, a dot on a map he'd memorized, tucked into a ravine a few miles south. It was a long shot. Homesteads were often abandoned, their owners broken by the harshness of the land. But it was his only chance. He urged Buck forward, leaning low against the horse's neck to shield his face from the ice-laced wind. Visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. The world became a maelstrom of white, the ground and sky merging into a single featureless void. He navigated by instinct, by the feel of the terrain sloping downwards, his internal compass honed by years of solitude. The horse stumbled, and Cole felt a lurch of fear. A broken leg out here, for either of them, was a death sentence. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the fast-deepening snow. He would walk, leading the horse, feeling for the ground with every step. The cold was a physical entity, a relentless pressure that sought out every gap in his clothing. It numbed his fingers, then his feet. He focused on the next step, and the one after that, a grim, plodding rhythm against the howl of the wind. Just as the first tendrils of a dangerous, sleepy warmth began to creep into his limbs, a sign of advanced hypothermia, he smelled it. Faint but unmistakable. Wood smoke. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through his cold-induced apathy. He pushed forward, his pace quickening, and nearly walked into it. A low-slung cabin, its shape almost completely obscured by drifting snow. A single weak yellow light shone from a window, a tiny beacon in the vast, roaring darkness. He had found it. He staggered to the door, his gloved hand fumbling for the crude wooden latch. There was no time for courtesy, for knocking. This was a matter of life and death. He pushed the door open, a blast of wind and snow invading the small space, and nearly collapsed over the threshold. The room was small, lit by a single flickering lantern and the dying embers of a fire in a stone hearth. A woman stood by the fireplace, her back to him, a rifle held loosely in her hands. She turned at his entrance, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. She was young, her face thin and pale, etched with a weariness that went beyond her years. 2 small bundles, wrapped in blankets, lay in a wooden cradle near the hearth. Babies. Twins. The sight sent a jolt through him. A woman and 2 infants, alone in the teeth of a blizzard. The room was cold, far colder than it should have been with a fire going. He saw why immediately. The woodpile next to the hearth contained only a few small logs and a handful of splinters. The fire was starving. He pushed the door shut, the latch groaning in protest as he threw his weight against the wind. He pulled down his neckerchief, his face a raw mask of windburn. "Ma'am," he managed, his voice a rough croak. Storm came up fast. The woman didn't lower the rifle. Her knuckles were white. "Who are you?" Her voice was quiet but steady. "Cole," he said simply. "Was tracking an elk. Got caught out." He looked pointedly at the dying fire, then at the cradle. "You're low on wood." Her defiance seemed to crumble, replaced by a wave of desperation that she fought to control. "The pile's empty. My husband. He was supposed to be back from Miller's Creek 2 days ago. He took the big axe. She was a widow then. Or might as well be. No one caught out in this storm was coming back." Cole's pragmatic mind assessed the situation with brutal clarity. A dying fire. No wood. A storm that could last for days. 2 infants who wouldn't survive a few hours in the cold. He was their only hope, and they were his. Without the shelter of this cabin, he would be dead by morning. It was a harsh, unspoken contract, sealed by the howling of the wind against the thin cabin walls. He slowly unbuckled his gun belt, letting it drop to the floor. It was a gesture of trust, a signal that he was not a threat. "I have a hatchet in my saddle roll," he said, his gaze steady on hers. "There's a stand of deadfall pine in the ravine about 100 yards east. I saw it on my way in. It'll burn." The woman, Anna, finally lowered the rifle. Relief and suspicion still warred in her eyes. "They'll freeze," she whispered, her voice breaking as she looked toward the cradle. Cole nodded, his expression grim. He turned, his body aching with cold, and faced the door again. He had just come in from the white hell of the storm, and now he had to go back out into it. But it was the only choice. "Bar the door behind me," he said, his hand on the latch. "Keep the babies warm." The wind tore at him the moment he stepped outside, a physical blow that staggered him. He fought his way to the horse, the animal a ghostly shape huddled against the lee side of the cabin. Buck was covered in a thick layer of snow, his head low. Cole scraped the ice from the horse's back and unstrapped his saddle roll with fumbling, numb fingers. The hatchet felt like a block of ice in his hand. He gave the horse a rough pat on the neck. "Stay put, boy." Not for long. He turned toward the ravine, a dark, sloping slash in the white landscape, 100 yards. It might as well have been a mile. He pulled his hatchet and began the trek, leaning into the wind, his eyes narrowed to slits. The world was a disorienting swirl of snow. He navigated by the feel of the land, by the memory of the terrain he'd crossed moments before. The stand of deadfall pine was a godsend. Dry, seasoned wood, protected from the worst of the moisture by the thick canopy of the living trees above. He set to work, the rhythmic shock of the hatchet, riding into frozen wood, a counterpoint to the storm's roar. Each swing was an effort, his muscles stiff with cold, his lungs burning. He ignored the pain, focusing on the task. He chopped until he had a pile of limbs, then broke them down into manageable lengths, his breath misting and freezing on his beard. He could only carry so much at once. He bundled the load together with a short length of rope from his pack, a load that would have been easy on a clear day, but was a back-breaking burden now. He hauled it onto his shoulder and began the agonizing journey back to the cabin. He fell twice, the snow swallowing him, the weight of the wood driving him down. Both times he fought his way back to his feet, driven by the image of the 2 small bundles in the cradle and the dying fire. When he finally reached the door and kicked it with his boot, Anna slid the bar back immediately. He stumbled inside, dropping the load of wood with a crash that echoed in the small room. He stood for a moment, chest heaving, covered in snow from head to foot, the cold radiating off him in waves. Anna was already at the hearth, feeding the precious wood into the embers. The fire caught, greedily consuming the dry pine, and a wave of life-giving warmth began to push back the chill. He didn't wait. He turned and went back out into the storm for another load, and then another. It was a brutal, punishing cycle. Out into the screaming wind and biting cold, the exertion making him sweat despite the freezing temperatures, then back into the relative warmth of the cabin, the brief respite a torment that made the next trip even harder. On his fourth trip, he found the tracks. They were faint, already being filled in by the driving snow, but they were unmistakable. A wolf, a big one, and it was circling the cabin. The storm had made the animals bold. The scent of life, of a vulnerable woman and her children, was a powerful lure. The stakes had just been raised. It wasn't just the cold they had to fight now. The fire roared now, a hungry, crackling beast that held the cold at bay. Cole had stacked a formidable pile of wood inside the cabin, enough to last the night, perhaps longer. The small room was filled with a warm yellow light, a sanctuary against the white fury outside. Anna had prepared a thin stew from the last of her salted meat and some dried vegetables. It was meager fare, but to Cole it tasted like a feast. He ate in silence, his focus on the immediate tasks ahead. The wolf tracks had changed the equation. The blizzard was no longer their only enemy. He stood and walked to the single window, wiping the condensation from the glass. He could see nothing but the swirling chaos of the snow. "You have enough food to last?" he asked, his back still to her. "For a few days, if we're careful," Anna replied. She was sitting in a rocker by the fire, one of the infants cradled in her arms, the other asleep in the cradle. "My husband." David. He was a good provider. But he wasn't expecting a storm this early. Cole nodded. The land was unforgiving of miscalculations. "Your rifle, is it loaded?" "Yes," she said. "And I know how to use it." He didn't doubt her. There was a strength in her, a resilience forged by hardship. She was no damsel in distress. She was a survivor, fighting for her children. "Good," he said. "They'll be hungry. The storm makes them bold." He checked his own pistol, the Colt Peacemaker, ensuring the action was clean and the cylinders were full. He moved to the cabin door, inspecting the bar he'd dropped into place. It was thick, but the hinges looked weak. He found a wedge of wood and hammered it into the gap between the door and the frame, tightening it. He then moved to the window, inspecting the shutter. It was flimsy. A determined animal could tear it from its leather hinges. He found a length of rope and lashed the shutter tight, then braced it with a piece of firewood. Every action was deliberate, efficient. He was turning the cabin into a fortress, a defensible position against the siege of the storm and its predators. Anna watched him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. He was a stranger, a rough-looking man who had appeared out of the blizzard. Yet he moved with a purpose and competence that was profoundly reassuring. He was a man who understood the harsh realities of this world. As the night deepened, the storm seemed to intensify. The wind shrieked, and the walls of the cabin groaned under the strain. At one point, a sound, low and mournful, cut through the noise of the wind. A howl. It was close. Cole's hand went to his pistol. He moved to the wall next to the door, listening. Another howl answered the first, this one from the other side of the cabin. A pack. Anna clutched her baby tighter, her eyes wide. Cole met her gaze, his own expression grim but calm. "They're testing the perimeter," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Looking for a weak spot." They were trapped. The resources inside were finite. The fire needed constant feeding. The food wouldn't last forever. Outside, the blizzard raged, and a pack of hungry wolves circled, waiting. The long, tense night had just begun. The night wore on, each hour marked by the howling of the wind and the occasional chilling calls of the wolves. Cole and Anna took turns watching, a silent, unspoken agreement. While one dozed fitfully in a chair, the other sat by the fire, rifle or pistol in hand, listening. The fire was their lifeline, and they fed it with a miser's care, adding one log at a time, making the precious wood last as long as possible. During one of his watches, Cole heard a new sound, a persistent scratching at the back wall of the cabin near the small root cellar door. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. He motioned for Anna to stay quiet, though she was already awake, her eyes fixed on him. He crept to the back wall, his pistol drawn. The scratching stopped. He pressed his ear to the rough-hewn logs. Silence. Then, a heavy thud, as if a large body had thrown itself against the wall. The logs groaned. The wolves were actively trying to break in. He returned to the fireplace and picked up the long iron poker, its tip glowing a faint red from the heat. He handed it to Anna. "If anything breaks through, use this. Aim for the eyes." His voice was cold, tactical. There was no room for fear, only for action. He took up his position by the door, the primary weak point. The long night became a series of small, tense dramas. A shadow moving past the window, a frantic scratching at the roof, the constant, unnerving proximity of the hungry pack. They were in a state of siege, and their small cabin was the only thing keeping them alive. Just before dawn, when the cold was at its most intense and their spirits at their lowest, a new sound began. A deep, groaning creak from above. Cole looked up at the ceiling. A fine dusting of snow was sifting down from between the roof beams. "The snow," he said, his voice grim. "The weight is too much." The roof, a simple construction of logs and sod, was not designed to hold the several feet of heavy, wet snow that the blizzard had dumped on it. It was beginning to fail. This was the reversal, the midpoint crisis that changed everything. The sanctuary was becoming a trap. A section of the roof over the far corner began to sag visibly. The groaning grew louder, more insistent. It was a countdown to collapse. They had to make a choice. Stay in the main room and risk being crushed, or move to the only other defensible space, the root cellar. The cellar was small, cold, and dark, a cramped hole in the frozen ground. But its ceiling was reinforced by the cabin floor above, and it had a sturdy trapdoor-style entrance. It was their only viable option. "We're moving," Cole said, his decision made in an instant. "Bring the babies." "And the blankets." "All of them." He began to move with a swift, desperate urgency. He kicked the remaining firewood down the cellar steps, followed by the last of the food and the water bucket. Anna, her face a pale mask, bundled the infants tightly, her movements quick and sure. The groaning from the roof was now punctuated by sharp cracks, the sound of wood splintering under an unbearable load. "Go," Cole commanded, holding the trapdoor open. Anna descended the steep wooden steps into the darkness, clutching her children. Cole threw the lantern down after her, then his rifle and saddlebags. He was about to follow when a large section of the roof gave way with a deafening roar, showering the room in a cascade of snow, sod, and splintered wood. The fire hissed and died, plunged into darkness, and buried under the debris. The blizzard screamed into the breached cabin. Their options had narrowed to a single dark hole in the ground. The root cellar was a cold, cramped tomb. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the weak, flickering glow of the lantern Cole had managed to save. The air was frigid and smelled of damp earth and potatoes. Above them, they could hear the relentless howl of the wind through the shattered roof of the cabin, a constant, menacing reminder of their vulnerability. The sudden collapse had plunged them from a state of tense readiness into one of raw, primal survival. The main room of the cabin was now uninhabitable, a frozen, snow-filled ruin. The fortress had been breached, not by the wolves, but by the sheer, indifferent weight of the storm. Anna huddled on the dirt floor, her body a shield around the two blanket-wrapped infants. They were stirring, their faint cries thin and sharp in the cold air. Fear, cold and sharp as an icicle, was a palpable presence in the small space. They had shelter of a sort, but they had lost the fire. Without a source of heat, the babies wouldn't last long. Cole's mind raced, his pragmatic brain sorting through their drastically reduced options. They had blankets, a little food, and a single lantern that was consuming its precious fuel with every passing moment. It was not enough. He looked around the small cellar. It was bare-walled dirt, with a few empty shelves and a pile of burlap sacks in one corner. In another, he saw it, the wood he had thrown down before the collapse. And next to it, a small, cast-iron stove, disconnected and dark. It must have been Anna's husband's project, a new addition for the cabin that he never got to install. It was their only chance. A desperate, risky plan began to form. "The stove," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet whimpers of the infants. "Does it have a flue pipe?" Anna looked up, her eyes wide in the lantern light. "Yes," she whispered. "It's in sections. Over there." She pointed to a corner he hadn't seen. A stack of stovepipe sections, still in their paper wrapping. It was a long shot. They had no way to vent the smoke properly through the cellar ceiling. But the collapsed main roof offered a chaotic, unintended alternative. If he could run the pipe up through the trapdoor and out through the debris of the collapsed roof, it might just work. The risk was enormous. A poorly vented stove would fill the small cellar with carbon monoxide, a silent killer. But freezing to death was a certainty. "Help me," he commanded. They worked together, their movements clumsy in the cold and darkness. They wrestled the heavy iron stove into the center of the cellar. Cole found a flat stone to place it on, giving it a stable base. Then he began to assemble the flue pipe, his cold, stiffened fingers struggling with the metal joints. Anna, seeing his plan, began to tear strips from the burlap sacks, stuffing them into the cracks around the trapdoor frame, trying to create a seal against the drafts. It was a race against time. The temperature in the cellar was dropping rapidly. The baby's cries were growing weaker. This was their escalation, their desperate gamble. A ticking clock measured in degrees of falling temperature and the fading warmth of two tiny bodies. He had the pipe assembled. Now came the hardest part, getting it vented through the wreckage above. Cole climbed the cellar stairs, pushing the trapdoor open just enough to peer into the devastation above. The cabin's main room was a chaotic scene of destruction. A huge section of the roof had caved in, leaving a gaping hole to the storm-filled sky. Snow swirled through the opening, piling in deep drifts against the far wall. The wind howled through the breach, a mournful, hungry sound. He had to run the stovepipe up through this wreckage, securing it somehow so it would draw properly and not be torn away by the wind. It was a task that seemed impossible. He took a deep breath of the freezing air and began to work. He shoved the first section of pipe up through the trapdoor, then climbed out into the ruined cabin. The cold was a stunning, brutal shock after the relative shelter of the cellar. Snow immediately caked his clothes and hair. He wrestled the pipe section through the debris, angling it toward the hole in the roof. He used splintered roof beams and chunks of sod to create a makeshift brace, working with a frantic energy born of desperation. Down below, Anna waited in the growing cold, listening to the sounds of his struggle. She had done all she could, reinforcing the seal around the trapdoor and wrapping the infants in every remaining scrap of blanket. Her role now was to wait, to trust the stranger who had become their unlikely guardian. Cole added another section of pipe, then another, pushing it higher. His hands were raw, bleeding from scrapes against the splintered wood and frozen metal, but he didn't feel the pain. His entire focus was on this single, critical task. Finally, the pipe cleared the top of the debris pile. Its open end pointed at the gray, churning sky. He secured it as best he could, wedging it between two heavy, snow-covered logs. It was a crude, ugly solution, but it might just hold. He scrambled back down into the cellar, pulling the trapdoor shut behind him, sealing them once more into their earthen refuge. He was covered in snow, his beard thick with ice. "It's done," he panted, his breath pluming in the cold air. "Let's see if it holds." He knelt before the small stove, stuffing it with dry kindling and a few of the smaller logs. He used one of his last matches to light it. For a tense moment, the kindling just smoldered, a puff of acrid smoke filling the cellar. Anna held her breath. Then a small flame flickered to life. Cole gently blew on it, nursing it until it caught. He closed the stove door, listening. He could hear the telltale whoosh of air being drawn up the flue. It was working. The pipe was drawing. A wave of relief, so powerful it was dizzying, washed over him. The small iron stove began to radiate a gentle, life-saving heat. It wasn't much, but it was enough to fight back the killing cold. They had won a temporary victory. They had heat. But their ordeal was far from over. As the stove warmed the small space, a new sound reached them from above. It wasn't the wind or the wolves. It was the sound of horses and the low murmur of men's voices. Someone else was out in the storm. And it was unlikely they were friendly. The voices from above were muffled by the snow and the intervening floorboards, but they were unmistakably human. Cole extinguished the lantern with a quick puff, plunging the cellar into near total darkness, save for the faint orange glow leaking from the stove's small grate. He held up a hand, signaling for absolute silence. Anna instinctively pulled the bundled infants closer, her body tense. "Corbett," she mouthed, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. Cole's expression tightened. He didn't know the name, but the terror on her face told him everything he needed to know. These were not rescuers. This was the warlord, the antagonist he hadn't known they had. Above them, boots thumped on the floor of the porch. A man cursed loudly at the sight of the collapsed roof. "Damn storm did my work for me," a voice boomed, rough and cruel. "Told you she wouldn't last the winter, boys. The land's mine now." The voice was filled with a triumphant, predatory glee. They could hear the men moving around, their footsteps crunching in the snow that filled the cabin. "See if you can find the bodies," the voice, presumably Corbett's, commanded. "The widow and her brats. I want proof for the magistrate." The words sent a chill down Cole's spine, colder than any blizzard. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a deliberate, predatory act. Corbett had used the storm as cover, coming to claim the widow's land, assuming the elements would eliminate any witnesses. Their showdown was at hand. They were trapped below ground, with a single rifle, a pistol, and dwindling ammunition. Corbett had at least 2 other men with him, and they were armed and operating in the open. But Cole had the terrain, or what was left of it, on his side. He knew the layout of the cellar. They did not. He looked at the stovepipe, the jury-rigged flue that was their lifeline. It was also a liability. Sooner or later, Corbett's men would spot the smoke, or the pipe itself, sticking out of the wreckage. He had to act first. His mind became a tactical map. The trapdoor was the only way in or out. It was a kill zone. The darkness was his ally. He checked his Colt, the familiar weight a comfort in his hand. He looked at Anna. Her fear was still there, but it was overlaid with a hard, resolute anger. She was not going to let this man take her home and harm her children. She held up the heavy, glowing-tipped fire poker, a silent question in her eyes. Cole gave a single, sharp nod. This was the climax. The confrontation was not just against a man, but against a ruthless force that used the law and the land itself as a weapon. And it would be decided here, in the cold, dark earth beneath a ruined cabin, with the blizzard as its witness. He moved to the base of the cellar steps, melting into the shadows, his pistol held ready. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a protector, and he would turn this tomb into a fortress. Cole pressed himself into the shadows at the bottom of the cellar stairs, the cold earth at his back. The darkness was his shield. He was a creature of this environment now, patient and deadly. Above, Corbett's men moved carelessly through the ruined cabin, their voices loud and confident. They were scavengers, not soldiers. That was their weakness. "Nothing over here, boss," one of the men called out. "Just a pile of snow. Roof must have caved in right on top of 'em. Check everywhere." Corbett's voice boomed back. "I want to be sure." Cole heard footsteps approach the cellar trapdoor. A boot kicked at it, testing its strength. "Hey, what's this?" The man knelt. Cole could hear the wood creaking above him. This was it, the first move. The man grunted as he heaved, and the trapdoor lifted, flooding the top of the stairs with a rectangle of gray, storm-filled light. A silhouette appeared, peering down into the darkness. "It's a root cellar," the man called out. "Dark as pitch down here." Cole didn't move. He didn't breathe. He let the man's eyes try to adjust to the gloom. He waited for the man to commit, to start down the stairs. "Well, get down there," Corbett ordered impatiently. They might have tried to hide. The silhouette became a man, cautiously descending the steep steps, his rifle held awkwardly in front of him. 1 step, 2 steps. He was halfway down, his eyes still useless in the dark. Cole moved. He didn't fire. A gunshot would give away his exact position. He lunged forward, a ghost in the darkness, and swung his pistol like a club, a single brutal blow to the side of the man's head. The man grunted in surprise and pain, his rifle clattering down the steps as he tumbled into the cellar, unconscious. Before the second man or Corbett could react to the noise, Cole was already scrambling up the stairs, using the element of surprise. He emerged into the ruined cabin, a whirlwind of motion. The second man was standing a few feet away, his back turned, looking toward Corbett. Cole didn't hesitate. He charged, driving his shoulder into the man's back, sending him sprawling face first into a snowdrift. Corbett spun around, his hand flying to the pistol on his hip, his face a mask of shock and fury. He was a big man, broad and powerful, but he was slow. Cole was faster. He kicked the fallen man's rifle out of reach and dove behind the remains of a sturdy oak table, the wood groaning as Corbett's first shot splintered the edge. The fight was on. It was a chaotic, three-dimensional battle. Cole used the wreckage as cover, moving constantly, making himself a difficult target. Corbett roared in frustration, firing into the shadows. Outside, the blizzard howled, its fury a fitting soundtrack to the violence within. Down in the cellar, Anna stood guard over the unconscious man, the fire poker held like a spear, ready to defend her children against any threat. The showdown was not about brute force. It was about tactical choices. Cole knew he was outgunned. He had to use the environment. He grabbed a handful of loose snow and dirt and flung it toward Corbett. The man flinched, momentarily blinded, and Cole used that split second to move again, circling around a massive pile of debris. He was hurting Corbett, forcing him toward the largest, most unstable section of the collapsed roof. Corbett, enraged, charged after him, his heavy boots slipping on the icy floor. It was the mistake Cole had been waiting for. Now, Cole yelled. He fired his pistol, not at Corbett, but at a splintered roof beam above him, the one holding back a huge, precarious mass of snow. The shot rang out, and the beam cracked. With a deep, groaning roar, the rest of the roof gave way, burying Corbett in an avalanche of snow and timber. The silence that followed the collapse was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the newly enlarged hole in the roof. The battle was over. Cole stood, his pistol still aimed at the mountain of snow and wreckage where Corbett had been. There was no movement. The warlord was buried, defeated by the very storm he had sought to use as a weapon. The second man, the one Cole had tackled into the snowdrift, was beginning to stir. Cole crossed the ruined room in 3 quick strides and relieved him of his pistol, his movements efficient and decisive. The man looked up, his face a mixture of fear and disbelief. "He's gone," Cole said, his voice flat. "Get your friend from the cellar and ride out." "Don't come back." The man scrambled to obey, his bravado gone, replaced by the primal fear of a defeated animal. He and his partner, now conscious and groaning, stumbled out of the cabin and disappeared into the storm. Cole stood for a long moment in the center of the devastation, the cold seeping back into his bones. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He had survived. More importantly, they had survived. He made his way back to the cellar. Anna was at the top of the stairs, the fire poker still in her hand, her eyes searching his. "It's over," he said quietly. The relief that washed over her face was a thing of beauty. She sagged against the doorframe, the strength that had held her up for days finally giving way. The debts of the trail were settled, not in coin, but in violence and survival. He had paid the debt he owed for the shelter she had given him, and in doing so, he had saved her life and the lives of her children. He helped her back down into the relative warmth of the cellar. He tended to the small stove, adding more wood, coaxing the life-saving heat back into the small space. They were alive. The costs had been high. The cabin was destroyed. Their future was uncertain, but they were alive. He looked at the two infants, sleeping peacefully now in their cradle, oblivious to the life-and-death struggle that had just taken place above them. He had kept them warm. He had honored his promise. The truth was revealed, not just of Corbett's greed, but of their own resilience. In the heart of the storm, they had found the strength to fight back and win. As the first light of dawn filtered through the swirling snow, the wind began to lose its savage edge. The blizzard was breaking. They spent the morning in the cellar, the small stove providing just enough warmth to keep the killing cold at bay. They shared the last of the food, a few strips of salted meat and some hard biscuits, a silent meal of shared survival. The immediate threat was gone, but the reality of their situation was stark. The cabin was uninhabitable. Anna was a widow with 2 infants, her home in ruins, facing a brutal winter alone. When the storm had subsided enough to be safe, Cole climbed out of the cellar to survey the damage. The world was a sea of white. The snow drifted higher than a man's head. The cabin was a wreck, its roof a gaping maw open to the sky. But the walls were mostly intact, and the stone fireplace stood tall amidst the debris. It could be rebuilt, but it would take time and resources Anna didn't have. He found his horse, Buck, shivering but alive, huddled in the lee of the cabin where he had left him. The animal's resilience was a small, good thing in a world of hardship. He spent the next 2 days helping Anna salvage what they could. They cleared a path to the door and began the back-breaking work of digging out the main room. They recovered furniture, bedding, and kitchen supplies, anything that hadn't been crushed by the collapse. Cole, using his hatchet and a saw they found in the debris, began the process of clearing the fallen timbers, his movements steady and purposeful. A change had occurred between them. The initial suspicion and desperation had been replaced by a quiet, profound camaraderie. They worked together with an easy, unspoken understanding, a team forged in crisis. He was no longer just a stranger who had stumbled out of the storm. He was the man who had protected her children, who had faced down her enemies, who was now helping her put the pieces of her life back together. On the 3rd day, under a clear, cold sky, he resaddled Buck. The trail was open. He could ride on. His duty was done. He had found shelter, paid his debt, and survived. That was the code he had always lived by. Anna came out of the cabin, one of the babies bundled in her arms. She stood before him, her expression unreadable. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm a man of the trail," he said, the words feeling hollow even to him. It was what he always did. He never stayed. "There's a settlement, Miller's Creek, about a day's ride from here," she said. "You could tell them what happened. Tell them about Corbett. Tell them the widow from the ravine needs help." It was a simple request, but it was also a tether, a connection to the world he always kept at a distance. He looked at her, at the small, vulnerable life she held in her arms, and at the ruined cabin behind her. He thought of the empty trail ahead, of the solitary camps and the lonely horizons. For the first time, it didn't seem like freedom. It seemed like an absence. The land was the same, vast and indifferent. But he was not. The isolated survivor had become a guardian, a partner. The experience had tested him, and in doing so, had transformed him. He looked from her face to the distant mountains, then back again. He swung down from the saddle. "The roof needs fixing before the next snow," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'd best get started." He would ride to Miller's Creek, but he would be back. The trail could wait. He had found something here in the heart of the storm that he hadn't even known he was looking for. A reason to stay.